Hi, my name's Katie Stasaski, student at the George Washington University. I'm here with Professor Derek Malone-France, Executive Director of the University Writing Program at the George Washington University, where he's also an Associate Professor in the Departments of Philosophy and Religion. The academic areas of interest include philosophical and religious implications of astrobiology and space exploration. This interview is being conducted for the NASA Astrobiology Debates, in which debaters from different schools around the country will be discussing Resolved, an overriding ethical obligation to protect and preserve extraterrestrial microbial life and ecosystems should be incorporated into international law. First question. Professor, given your background in philosophy and ethical studies, which issues do you see as being raised by the topic in your area of expertise that students are going to have to grapple with during the debate?
Wow, there are so many. I think, one of the really fun things about being involved with astrobiology, especially in the expansive way that NASA defines that, which includes not just the search for life elsewhere, obviously, which is the main focus of the resolution, but also the implications of that search for our understanding of the origins and evolution of life on Earth, which of course has, first of all, let's start with tremendous religious implications. If, for example, we were to find even very simple microbial life that was clearly of a distinct origin from Earth life. So say, for example, we find life not on Mars, where there might have been a co-origin. For example, life could have evolved on Mars first and then moved to Earth during the period when Mars was habitable sooner because of the sun's expansion and heat. It was eventually burned out almost, right? But material could have moved over. That would still be interesting, but if we found microbial life on Enceladus, a moon of Saturn, where the conditions are so completely different environmentally, or much more life outside of our solar system, where it would almost be guaranteed that it had originated distinctly, separately from our form of life, religious people, in at least some major traditions, Christianity comes to mind, right? Obviously, with its very prominent focus on the notion of the creation of life here on Earth and of the specialness of human life, would have to make some adjustments. Now, what those adjustments would be like for each individual religious community would depend upon the way they view the traditions that are already in place. So some Christians, having a very literalistic understanding of the book of Genesis, might find the discovery of a second origin of life genuinely theologically traumatic. And for them, there would be profound religious implications, which obviously would bleed over into moral and ethical implications, including those having to do with their political membership, right? In a pluralistic democracy, like ours in the contemporary scientific era in which we live, these kinds of beliefs have been a focus not just of personal ethical and moral deliberations and debates, but also very prominent political ones. Whereas a Christian who has a more metaphorical understanding of the Bible, say, would adjust to this in a very different way. And in fact, during many periods of Christian history, when there was a belief of in life on other planets, many Christians actually embraced that. So religiously, it would depend, right? Buddhists would have a completely different reaction than Christians would. And then on the other hand, in a philosophical context, obviously the political connotations are profound. We live in a globalized world, but not a global political society. So who makes the decisions about what we do in relation to these findings, right? If we come across microbial life in or beyond our solar system, is it up to the country whose technology, or maybe even the corporation, let's say SpaceX finds it before the United States, or maybe as a joint venture that happens? Who controls that material, who makes the decisions, and ultimately, who then has some power to define humanity's relationship to this really profound and impactful discovery? I could go on, but that's maybe enough for the moment.
Yeah. What are your views on the stronger, which do you believe would be the stronger argument for who would be in control of the political side of how we should approach microbial life that we encounter?
Well, you know, it's interesting. On the one hand, as somebody who's worked in democratic political theory, um, my inclination is always to err on the side of wider circles of discourse, which I think leads to greater ethical legitimacy and political justification for the decisions or the actions that are made or taken. And in that sense, one would say, well, these are events that would impact the entire human race. And so it can't be up to a single political community or certainly a single corporate entity or an individual human being to make those kinds of decisions unilaterally. But on the other hand, throughout human history, the evolution of our species and of our communities and our political societies has been driven by discoveries that were made often by individuals or small groups without the prior validation of the larger communities of which they are a part, much less the larger human community. And so when you think about it in those kinds of historical terms, say the United States or China or India or one of the other space exploring countries to make contact individually on its own first, would have a strong claim to a historical right to set the terms of that contact. I think absent more robust international legal agreements of the sort that are going to be contemplated by the debaters here in relation to this resolution.
So going off some of the philosophical questions that you raised, what are your views on the question of whether extraterrestrial microbial life has moral standing?
You know, it's funny. One of the things that came out of recent conversations among scholarly specialists at the Library of Congress that I took part in around this issue was the question of why we put such a premium on life, right? Why are we looking for life? Why is life so important to us? And I think part of the answer is that traditionally speaking, human moral systems, most of which in one way or another, positively or negatively, evolved out of religious systems, have seen life as a special component of the universe that deserves a kind of respect that is not requisite in relation to the non-living universe. But of course now, as the science has proceeded and understanding of the way in which the natural world operates has proceeded over the last several centuries, it's become almost impossible for anyone in the current context to offer a fully satisfactory definition of what life is, as opposed to non-life. And some of the most interesting arguments that are taking place philosophically, for example, in this area relate to the concept of artificial life, which is not the same as artificial intelligence. Artificial life can be a much simpler construct, a mechanical form of organizational entity that might have the same kinds of properties that you would describe if giving a very basic definition of life predicated on, say, Darwinian evolution, right? So the kind of mechanism that could actually replicate itself, right? But that doesn't involve organic protein folds and the other elements that we associate with ourselves or plants or insects or even microbes. Why then give special ethical status to perhaps even very primitive microbial forms of life, whatever that means, that we might encounter in outer space? I think there are a number of reasons, but the first one that I would give actually has little to do with the microbes and everything to do with us. There's an old story or anecdote or sort of urban myth, or I don't know what it is, but a story of a man coming along and seeing a little boy pulling the wings off of a fly, and the little boy says, "It's not hurting him. It's just a fly." And the man says, "I want you to stop, not because of the fly, but because of what it's doing to you, that you're doing this." Right? The concern is for the way in which the little boy's moral imagination is being shriveled in this encounter with something that he believes he doesn't have to respect in any way, the kind of casual cruelty, right? And I think whatever we come to decide about whether simple microbial life can have the kinds of experiences that we associate with the ability to suffer, say, for example, without absolute knowledge one way or another, and without absolute agreement among ourselves about what that moral status for those kinds of entities ought to be, if any, then it seems to me that erring on the side of moral caution is always the best approach, right? We don't want to put ourselves in a position of doing something that we regret. Humanity has, sadly, a long history of discovering after the fact that practices that were undertaken in relation to beings defined as others, be they non-humans or other kinds of humans, turn out to look very bad in retrospect. And so I think that's the kind of thing that astrobiology and space exploration more generally offers humanity an opportunity to overcome within relation to itself, right? This could be a moment where our species could transcend its own propensity to act without sufficient moral regard for the long-term consequences of those actions. And that's where I think this could be really exciting. It's not just something about, you know, sort of negations, right? What don't we do? What can't we do? What conversations can't we have amongst this group or that group? But rather, what could we do that would spark a greater sense of global moral imagination in concert, working towards some end that all human beings have a kind of mutual interest in?
So, assuming that microbial life does have moral standing, what are your views on how we ought to assess a potential conflict between the needs of human beings and the needs of extraterrestrial microbial life?
I think that from my point of view, and speaking as somebody who works in the particular specialization that I do work in, which obviously frames my answer, my focus is on procedure, political, deliberative procedure. I don't anticipate us ever reaching a point where humanity has a totally shared consensus on any particularly meaningful moral issue. I think that's an unlikely outcome as long as we are human beings. So then what does legitimacy look like? I think it looks like a genuine grappling with all of the dimensions of a situation rather than bracketing off the dimensions that interest us and attending only to those, right? That's the economic or potentially colonialistic approach to space exploration, and particularly the contact with other forms of life. There are those who have argued that we should have an absolute prohibition on engaging in any kind of contact beyond discovery with any forms of life. You know, so even going so far in some cases is to argue that, for example, if we found microbial life on Mars, we should bar ourselves ever from going to Mars, from interfering in it in any way. The moral imperative in that view being one of allowing the natural evolution of this microbe without our interference. Now, of course, one can get into an argument about what is natural or unnatural interference in an expanded cosmic environment. We are just one other environmental factor with which other lives would have to contend. And of course, the other end of the spectrum is the more, I'll put this in crasser terms than a defender of it would normally do, but those who would say, well, it's really about the human good and the value that can come to humans. If we don't find entities that are clearly at the same level of sophistication as ourselves, then we don't owe them much, if anything. And particularly, we don't owe simple life forms elsewhere any more than we owe them here, right? That's also a position that's out there. I think that the answer to whether either of those positions is correct is unclear, and obviously there are a lot of potential positions in between those that deal in the nuances of the context of contact and exactly what we think we're dealing with. And again, what I would revert to is that any discovery like this is going to take a long time to verify. we're not talking about within 10 years, probably, making physical contact with microbial life. But we might be talking about within 10 years finding signatures, indicators that clearly tell us that that life exists in a particular place. And then we start a conversation, and it's probably a 50-year conversation, even if that life is very close, because the technical challenges of actually physically reaching even our most local, so to speak, celestial neighbors, Mars or Venus or whatever, are obviously profound, and the expense is huge. And so I think that's where the possibility for a conversation about what we do with this discovery could morph into a broader conversation about how we understand ourselves and how we're relating to ourselves as a community and to other forms of life here on Earth. And of course, that is something that brings in another point that should be mentioned, which is the concern about whether finding life elsewhere and or continuing our exploration and eventual expansion into space makes us more or less protective of our environment here on Earth, right? Do we take our expansion beyond the Earth as an opportunity to get ourselves squared away here, to clean the mess up we've made here? Or does it look like an opportunity to say, well, we're gonna leave this garbage pile behind and we can go someplace else and start again? Of course, that would be extreme in terms of the expense and the technology again, but in the very long term, it could be a shift that would happen in our consciousness if this environment continues to degrade.
What are your views on the moral standing of future generations? If there is an obligation of future generations to preserve microbial life, how do we assess the importance of such an obligation to determine whether it's overriding or not?
Let me ask for a little clarification there. So you mean the moral obligation towards future generations of human beings that we preserve? Yeah, okay, good. Well, obviously, you know, we have, in my mind, strong moral obligations to future generations of human beings. It seems to me that the argument that people who don't exist yet don't have rights is not something that actually trumps the notion that, nevertheless, we have moral obligations to the indefinite future human community. One of which is to keep it going, obviously. And so that's where those who would say we really need to be more aggressive in terms of expanding into space, and we need to think of this not as exploitation, but as our one and only opportunity to keep the human race going in the long term. That's where they would plant their flag argumentatively, precisely on that notion of future generations. So that would be an argument, right, for not giving too much weight to moral considerations involving other forms of life if they got in the way of development, right, in the economic sense of that term. But on the other hand, even setting aside the kind of inclination towards moral caution that I advocated earlier, we now know that we destroyed a lot of value in deforestation of areas like the Amazon rainforest, where we are now finding that there are special kinds of organic chemicals that exist that can be used in medicine, other special kinds of food. This relates obviously also to things like GMO, right, where you have the engineered reduction of biodiversity. So if you think about that dynamic and you start to extend it to space, you have to think we cannot know what potential value would lie in the continued existence of forms of life that are distinct from the terrestrial stream. And if we were to destroy those, we could be destroying untapped wells of value for human generations that we would never be able to rediscover.
Are there any other areas of consideration you feel debaters might be grappling with this topic that we haven't discussed so far?
Well, I think for the most part at this point, leaders in the political sense of that term, and particularly thinking about leaders of the spacefaring nations, are mostly thinking about this in terms of power politics and international relations. And I don't necessarily say that as a critique. To a certain extent, that's their job, right? It's not their only job, and they, in my mind, perhaps privilege that aspect of it over much, but it's certainly understandable, right? Again, setting aside issues of contact, control of outer space is going to be a tremendous variable in the dynamics of military relations in the next, say, 20, 50, 100 years. And so that's understandable. But I think that there is this combining moment of crisis regarding the environment here on our planet and the issue of overpopulation, with a greater public awareness of just how far the technology of space exploration has come in the last 30 or 40 years. People were paying a lot of attention to this in the 60s and 70s because of the Cold War, Sputnik and all of that. And then, of course, there was the Viking mission to Mars to try and find life. And when there wasn't conclusive proof of life on Mars through the Viking mission, the public, I wouldn't say that the public lost interest, but that interest migrated in the direction of science fiction. And now, as the public is turning its attention back to the real science of space exploration, and NASA, I have to say, has done a really fantastic job of getting itself back in the news a lot, right? Which I actually think is important. People are starting to be aware that some of the kinds of, maybe not their extreme versions, but some of the kinds of moral narratives of human progress or the failure of human progress that are associated with science fiction are coming up on the horizon as possible aspects of our real future. And, it would be nice if the leaders of the countries that are involved in this most substantively could see an opportunity there for more collaborative and more discursive sort of engagement around that issue. It's become pretty clear, I think, that without a very radical change in the way in which decisions about the global environment and the decisions that relate to humanity as a whole are made, we might not have that long to go. I mean, we are approaching a critical mass of 11 billion people, probably in your lifetime, if not mine. And that's arguably simply unsustainable in any imaginable reality that doesn't involve something like magic. So this is maybe our last shot, and I think in that context, the fact that what we're talking about is so dramatic and so profound and so potentially transformative and revolutionary of our understanding of ourselves and our place in the universe, it might be the kind of rare leverage point around which human beings could actually get their act together and begin to behave a little bit more rationally. I'm not as hopeful as the sort of Star Trek Next Generation view of things, but I also hope that we don't have to destroy ourselves first, as that show imagined it, right, before we figure out that we ought to be cooperating.
Do you have any concluding remarks on the subject?
I would just say that I think it's really exciting that these debates are happening because, even someone like me, I'm, entering my mid 40s, I think I'm going to see contact. I mean, I think that is to say, I think we will discover signs of extraterrestrial life in my lifetime. But I don't think that I will see the culmination of efforts to rationalize a program for dealing with that discovery in concert with whatever solution, I hope, knock on wood, gets worked out for our own terrestrial environmental crisis. And that means it's all on you. It's on you and those younger than you who are going to be, as you said, the future generations of humanity who are going to be really grappling with this, which is going to be incredibly exciting as long as we don't screw it up for you too badly before you get to take the reins.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I thought you brought in a really interesting perspective, and I'm really excited to see how debaters use that in the upcoming debates.
Great. It was fun. I look forward to seeing some of the debates myself.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye.